Hello, this is Melanie Moon, and I am continuing the reading of the book Race in the City, which is a compilation of essays that were edited by a gentleman by the name of Henry Louis Taylor, Jr. The actual title of the book is Race in the City, Work, Community, and Protest in Cincinnati, 1820 to 1970. I'm now reading Chapter 6, and this is by Henry Louis Taylor, Jr., the editor of the book. The title of this chapter is City Building, Public Policy, the Rise of the Industrial City, and Black Ghetto-Slum Formation in Cincinnati, 1850 to 1940. Scholars of the Black urban experience have firmly established the place of racism in the ghetto-slum formation process. In a series of works written during the 1960s, Gilbert Osofsky, 1963, Seth Shiner, 1965, August Meyer, and Elliot Redwick, 1966, and Alan H. Spear, 1967, developed the standard theory of Black ghetto-slum formation. These historians argued that during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Black population growth, the industrial development of the Black community, the activities of the real estate industry, and widespread urban change combined with a national rise in racist ideology to produce the Black ghetto-slum. Racial hostility was the driving force behind this change process. Although racism was the focal point of their theory, these scholars nevertheless indicated that other factors such as urban change and the operation of the housing market also played major roles in ghetto-slum formation. Writing in the 1970s, Theodore Hirschberg and Kenneth L. Kusmer called upon historians to pay closer attention to the relationship between city building and the Black urban experience. Kusmer, in particular, urged scholars to study the role of city building, or structural forces as he referred to it, in ghetto-slum formation. Perhaps, Kusmer argued, the most significant example of the effect of structural forces in the Black urban experience is in the area of residential segregation. The historical development of the residential segregation of Black Americans is a more complex process than is usually recognized, because in studying single communities, historians have ignored the impact of divergence in urban structure on the growth of ghettoization. So while the link between racism and residential segregation has been well documented, much less is known about the role that city building plays in ghetto-slum formation and about the relationship between the rise of an industrial city and the emergence of ghetto slums. The purpose of this chapter is to determine the place of city building in Black ghetto formation. Specifically, it seeks to explain how the rise of the industrial city, the emergence of mass home ownership, zoning laws, building codes, city planning, and subdivision regulations led to the formation of a Black ghetto-slum in Cincinnati. The rise of an industrial city was accompanied by the separation of land use by function and by the dramatic growth of home ownership and the emergence of a residential environment stratified on the basis of housing cost and type. The location of African Americans at the bottom of the economic ladder placed them at a disadvantage in the quest for good housing and neighborhood conditions. Thus, in this new socioeconomic setting, home ownership and housing costs triggered a complex sorting and shifting process that gave birth to neighborhoods segregated on the basis of race and class. These forces, operating within the context of racial hostility, gave rise to the 20th century ghetto. The main idea undergirding this hypothesis is that city building shapes the Black residential experience, including ghetto-slum formation. The emphasis on city building is not meant to replace the standard theory of ghetto formation. Rather, it is to suggest a different but complementary way of understanding the formation of Black ghettos during the industrial city's rise. Cincinnati was selected as a model city because it experienced the spatial changes characteristic of the evolving industrial city: growing differentiation by function, decentralization, and residential segregation based on class and race. And because Cincinnati, in the teens and 20s, became a national leader in the city planning and housing reform movements, and because Cincinnati in the teens and 20s became a national leader in the city planning and housing reform movements. Led by the Better Housing League, a citizens group founded in 1916, the city gained a national reputation for planning and housing reform. And in 1925, Cincinnati became the first large American city to adopt an official city plan. And I think I have that plan. And I can download that and put it on in the comments there. Okay, this section says, the title of this section is Before the Ghetto-Slum, the Commercial City and the Biracial Residential Environment. Although located in a free, quote-unquote, free state, commercial Cincinnati was nevertheless a racist city in which blacks were subjected to tight social and occupational restrictions. The city, for example, was the site of bloody race riots in 1829, 1836, 1841, and 1862. Cincinnati blacks were prohibited by law from sitting on juries, testifying against whites in court, serving in the militia, attending public schools, securing relief, and being admitted to the poorhouse. They had to sit in segregated church pews and were buried in segregated graves in a potter's field. And their footnotes, as I have mentioned in the past, in all of these essays, they were researched. And there are footnotes, but I'm not going to say footnote after every footnote. Chapter 5, I did scan the footnote pages, the reference pages to the footnotes. And if it's requested, I will do the same for the other pages as well. I'm also trying to scan any maps, charts, tables, and we're going to superimpose those on the screen so that you don't have to keep looking at me, but you can look at the charts and the maps and things like much more interesting than looking at me. Okay, the color line also kept blacks tied to the bottom of Cincinnati's occupational ladder. The city's economy boomed during the commercial era. By 1850, Cincinnati had become the Queen City of the West, quote unquote, the 6th largest city in the United States, the 4th largest manufacturing city in the country, and the leading commercial and manufacturing city in the Allegheny region. This was Cincinnati's golden age. Yet, most black workers were confined to the lowest paying jobs at the bottom of the job ladder. More than 80% labored as unskilled workers, as roustabouts on the docks, as stewards on the steamboats, and as washerwomen, domestic servants, and cooks in the homes of white elites and in the city's hotels and boarding houses. Against difficult odds, about 8% of black workers did manage to become blacksmiths, coopers, bricklayers, and carpenters. Nevertheless, both skilled and unskilled black workers were excluded from the city's rapidly expanding industrial base. Only about 0.76, and there is a dot there, 0.76% of the city's blacks held factory jobs. A small black middle class did emerge during this period. About 6% of the black workforce found jobs as clerks, shopkeepers, peddlers, traders, barbers, teachers, and businessmen. Yet, despite a few success stories, most blacks held low-paying, menial jobs. Although most blacks were poor, and white prejudice, discrimination, and hostility infiltrated every aspect of their lives, a black ghetto slum did not form in commercial-era Cincinnati. A disproportionate number of blacks did live in alleys, apartments above stores, dilapidated wooden structures, and rickety tenements, but they still had white neighbors. An examination of the residential location of 2,109 blacks, representing 66% of the African American population, showed that blacks did not live in homogeneous, racially segregated enclaves. Although concentrated in the eastern section of Cincinnati and along the waterfront, most blacks nevertheless lived in small clusters, lodged within white-dominated residential areas. Whites not only lived on every street where blacks resided, but usually also outnumbered them. Even on those streets where blacks were most heavily concentrated, whites could be found living in large numbers. This situation, in most instances, had little to do with racial attitudes. White hostility, as previously mentioned, produced anti-black riots and omnipresent discrimination, but it did not produce residential segregation. The structure of the commercial city kept black ghettos from forming. The population had no choice but to mix. Lack of adequate transportation systems, mixed patterns of land use, and the ubiquity of cheap housing led to the dispersal of both the immigrant and black population. Cincinnati's experience was not unique. Throughout the 20th century in both the North and South, blacks lived in biracial residential areas. Even in the most segregated locations, blacks and whites lived adjacent to one another or shared the same dwellings. The next section is entitled Rise of the Industrial City, Land Use Change, and the Class-Stratified Residential Environment. Between the Civil War and the end of World War I, Cincinnati's commercial city was transformed into the spatially differentiated industrial city. Although failing the quest for urban supremacy, Cincinnati still experienced substantial growth during the latter half of the 19th century. Industrialization, population growth, and a transportation revolution were the driving forces behind this growth and development. For example, the value of Cincinnati's manufactured products increased from $54 million in 1851 to $262 million in 1910, while its population increased from 115,435 in 1850 to 401,247 by 1920. Commercial Cincinnati formed in a 6-square-mile basin surrounded by sharply rising hills. The Mill Creek Valley on the west and the Deer Creek Valley on the east were the only two entrances to the city. The hilly topography inhibited outward expansion, forcing most people to live in the basin area. Map 6.1. Cincinnati became a very crowded city. As late as 1870, only New York City was more congested. In the 1880s and 1890s, Cincinnati developed an intra-urban transportation system based on electric streetcars and inclines, a device that hoisted streetcars to the city's hilltops. Electrification of the intra-urban transportation system made outward expansion possible while simultaneously tying the growing city together. By 1912, Cincinnati had 222 miles of track. At the same time, through an aggressive annexation campaign, the city extended its physical boundaries from 6 square miles in 1850 to 52 square miles by 1930. Collectively, these events facilitated the residential development of vast stretches of vacant land, Map 6.2 and 6.3. The industrial city residential environment. The emergence of Cincinnati as an industrial city involved not only growth and expansion, but also a complex sorting out process in which commercial, industrial, and residential forms of land use were separated from each other and then each internally reorganized. The industrial city, like the commercial city, had its own unique pattern of land use and its own unique residential environment. Residential areas were not simply separated from other forms of land use. They were reorganized. The industrial city residential environment was a highly stratified one in which neighborhoods were segregated by housing cost and type. The territorial expansion that took place with the rise of industrial Cincinnati gave birth to new neighborhoods located outside the basin. In the commercial city, most Cincinnatians had resided in the basin, where the residential environment was characterized by tenement buildings and a heterogeneous population. This was a renter-dominated setting in which the rich and poor, the native and foreign, white and African Americans lived within a stone's throw of each other. It was also a place where dwelling units competed for space with factories, warehouses, office buildings, and railroad yards. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, residential land use began to lose the competitive struggle for space as industrial and commercial expansion slowly transformed the basin into a land use conversion zone where new factories, buildings, alterations, renovations, and expanding railroad lines engulfed dwelling units. By 1900, the conflict between economic and residential development in the basin was making the area an undesirable place to live. At the same time, electrically powered streetcars and inclined planes were making it possible for people to move out of the basin into new neighborhoods developing in other parts of Cincinnati. From about 1870 onward, elite, middle class, and higher paid workers gradually moved out of the basin into Mount Auburn, Mount Hope, Mount Harrison, Fairmount, Camp Washington, Cumminsville, Clifton, Clifton Heights, Corryville, Avondale, Walnut Hills, Mount Adams, Mount Lookout, Mount Healthy, Hyde Park, Pleasant Ridge, Oakley, and other sections of Cincinnati City. Between 1870 and 1940, the number of people living in the basin fell from 141,323 to 83,086. And the proportion of all Cincinnatians residing there dropped from 64 to 18%. Table 6.1. These figures do not tell the complete story. The outmigration had a racial dimension. The majority of those moving out were white. This outmigration turned into a flood in the 1910 to 1940 period, when 86,659 whites left, and the proportion of all whites living there dropped to 11%. The historic core was no longer their primary residential location. According to the historian Zane L. Miller, those remaining were primarily low-income workers and small businessmen serving a clientele close to their home neighborhoods. As whites moved out, blacks moved in. In the 1870s to 1940 period, the Black Basin population increased by 704%. By 1940, about 67% of Cincinnati's black population resided in the core, which was rapidly becoming the primary residential location of African Americans, Table 6.1. The movement of blacks into the basin and the movement of whites into the newly evolving valley and hilltop neighborhoods led to the growing residential segregation of African Americans. The index of dissimilarity developed by the sociologists Carl Tober and Alma Tober provides a measure of the growth of residential segregation in Cincinnati between 1850 and 1940. An examination of computed indices of dissimilarity for this period shows that in Cincinnati, a biracial residential environment persisted until 1920. Between 1920 and 1940, however, residential segregation increased dramatically as whites fled the basin. In the 70 years between 1850 and 1920, for example, Cincinnati's index of dissimilarity increased slightly from 0.375 to 0.480. But in the 20 years between 1920 and 1940, the dissimilarity index leaped from 0.480 to 0.710, Table 6.2. The rise of home ownership and the class-stratified residential environment. Those whites fleeing the basin were moving into new neighborhoods characterized by owner-occupied single-family dwelling units. By studying building permits issued for 16 select years between 1908 and 1938, insight into this evolving residential environment can be obtained. The permits issued during the period provide information on the volume, type, and cost of residential construction in Cincinnati by census tract. The data show that the volume of residential construction skyrocketed in Cincinnati during the 1920s and late 1930s. For instance, 82%, and this is in parenthesis, N equals 11,176, of the 13,659 residential building permits issued for select years in the 1908 to 1938 period were issued between 1923 and 1938. Most of this building activity took place during the 1920s. 40%, N equals 5,529, of the permits issued between 1923 and 1938 were issued in just 3 years: 1923, 1925, and 1928, Table 6.3. Significantly, virtually all new residential construction took place outside of the basin. Between 1908 and 1938, only 34, or 0.24%, of the 13,659 residential building permits issued were for the basin. And in the 1923 through 38 period, there were only 18 residential building permits issued for the basin. The single-family house was the predominant type of residential structure built during the period. Between 1923 and 1938, almost 84% of Cincinnati's new residential buildings were single-family dwellings, Table 6.3. In most instances, single-family houses were owner-occupied units. This belief is supported by data on home ownership. Between 1900 and 1930, home ownership in Cincinnati increased by 204% as the number of families owning their homes leaped from 14,891 to 45,253, Table 6.4. Most of the new houses in Cincinnati's growing neighborhoods fell into the moderate to high cost range. About 70% of the new housing cost $5,000 or more, with 53.4% falling into the $5,000 to $9,999 cost range, Table 6.5. Over time, the number of cheap housing units under $3,000 under construction fell dramatically. For instance, in 1908, cheap houses accounted for 50.9% of all new housing construction, but by the 1920 building boom, housing in this cost range accounted for only 2% of new residential construction. Cheap housing was not widely dispersed. Most of it was concentrated in the Basin area, only the waterfront, and in a few sections of the Mill Creek Valley Industrial District. Expensive housing, on the other hand, was located in the valley and hilltop neighborhoods, especially in the northern and eastern hilltop regions. The evolving industrial city residential environment did not replicate the mixed pattern of neighborhoods characteristic of the commercial city. Instead, for the first time, homogeneous neighborhoods began to appear. New houses were now commonly built only near houses of similar type and value. Neighborhoods grew more uniform. Before 1920, there were no building codes to regulate the construction of single-family dwellings, and there were no zoning regulations. Nevertheless, a system of regulation without law led to conformity in terms of type and cost of houses appearing in different neighborhoods. Cincinnati developers used a combination of deed restrictions and subdivision design to create neighborhoods segregated by housing type and cost. The neighborhoods evolving in the valley and hilltop regions became increasingly different from those in the Basin. Indeed, the newer the residential district, the greater the proportion of single-family dwellings, the more expensive the housing, and the better the neighborhood conditions. Likewise, the older the residential district, the greater the proportion of multifamily dwellings, the cheaper the housing, and the more deteriorated the neighborhood. Class had become the primary determinant of where people lived and the type of housing and neighborhood conditions available to them. By 1930, Cincinnati's neighborhoods had been divided into three distinct types of residential districts: low, moderate, and high rent, MAP 6.4. The creation of a residential environment based on home ownership changed people's attitudes toward the living place. Buying and building a home took place in a market economy. Before 1930, home buying was a risky financial journey. Institutions required large down payments, charged high interest rates, and demanded the repayment of loans within a very short period, typically from 2 to 5 years. So when a family used its savings to purchase a house, a big economic investment in the dwelling was made. This investment was risky because rising or falling property values determined the home buyer's fate. Also, because few people could pay off their mortgages within 2 to 5 years. Most counted on having it renewed again and again as needed. But mortgage renewal was not automatic. If a lending company believed that neighborhood conditions were declining and that housing values were depreciating, it might not renew the mortgage. If it happened, the home buyer might lose both the house and the money invested in it. By building houses that maintain the class character of neighborhoods and by keeping out quote unquote bad houses, factories, and businesses, home buyers maintained property values and protected the home investment. So, maintaining property values and protecting the home investment became part of the cult of home ownership and quote unquote neighborhood culture, thereby transforming neighborhoods into quote unquote defended territories. And I think you know where this is going. The next section: public policy and the rise of mass home ownership. The growth of neighborhoods in the valley and hilltop regions and the rise of mass home ownership transformed the housing reform movement in Cincinnati. In the 1865 to 1910 period, reformers believed that the city's crowded and unsanitary tenements caused pauperism and family disorganization, and thus represented a major threat to the basin as a residential environment. As early as 1865, the Cincinnati Relief Union, an association founded to aid the needy and worthy poor, argued that the filthy and unhealthy tenements threatened to contaminate an otherwise healthy and prospering city. Based on the notion that most Cincinnatians would continue to live in the congested basin, this view of residential development led to the emergence of a tenement reform movement centered on the use of building codes to regulate tenement buildings. The goal was to preserve the basin as a good residential environment by eliminating the tenement as a source of disease and social disorder. The two most important organizations to emerge in the tenement reform epoch were the United Jewish Charities and the Associated Charities. Both organizations pushed for passage and enforcement of tenement regulations. As a result of their activities, Cincinnati passed its first building code on August 15, 1898. The new law covered areas such as lot coverage, water closet accommodations, light shafts, and fire escapes. The reformers were not, however, happy with this building code. They wanted a stronger law. Yet in spite of support from groups such as the Union Bethel, the Elizabeth Gamble Deaconess Home, the Glen Industrial Home, the Mennonite Mission, and the Cincinnati City Council, the housing reformers did not achieve their goal of a tough building code until May 10, 1909. The new law greatly expanded the 1898 code, and most important, it made provisions for building code enforcement. The tenement house movement peaked with passage of the 1909 code. Out-migration from the basin and the growth of home ownership in valley and hilltop neighborhoods caused reformers to conclude that the basin was doomed as a good residential environment. This shift in thinking led to the creation of a new housing movement, one centered on the promotion of home ownership and the protection of new neighborhoods from an invasion of bad housing and factories and commercial enterprises. The new movement called for an extension of building codes to single-family dwellings and formulation of zoning laws, comprehensive city planning, and subdivision regulations. The first sign of this new idea of residential development appeared in 1912, when the reform mayor Henry Hunt called for an active housing movement. to secure, this is quotes, to secure a real home for every man, woman, and child in Cincinnati, end quote. He proposed the development of a rapid transit system to allow wage earners more freedom in choosing their housing, quote unquote. 1 year later, the National Housing Association met in Cincinnati. Following a tour of the city, the delegates declared that Cincinnati's problem was one of the most serious in the cities west of New York. This conference stimulated interest in the need to develop a systematic approach to solving the housing problem by establishing an organization devoted exclusively to housing reform. Then on July 10, 1916, as a result of the efforts of the Women's City Club, Max Sr., founder of the United Jewish Charities, and Courtney Dilwitty, secretary of the Anti-Tuberculosis League, the Better Housing League of Cincinnati, was founded. Max Sr. was elected president, A.O. Elsner, vice president, and Seti S. Kuhn, treasurer. The BHL, Better Housing League, became the leader of the new housing movement and ushered in a new era of housing reform in Cincinnati. Initially, the BHL's activities focused on tenement regulation. This change, however, was the hiring of Bleecker Marquette, a close associate of Lawrence Weiler, the Dean of Restrictive Tenement Reform, on September 1, 1918. Marquette argued in the BHL report that one of the most striking shifts in the housing movement was the change in emphasis from getting rid of slum conditions to providing decent shelter for the middle classes. He became the chief architect of Cincinnati's residential development strategy and the driving force behind its implementation. Under Marquette's leadership, the BHL's new residential development strategy was outlined in its first two published reports appearing in the 1919 and 1921. The 1919 report called for a revision of the city's building code so that it would cover the construction of 1- and 2-family houses. The League indicated that a revised building code would protect neighborhoods by keeping existing houses from deteriorating into slums. And in the 1921 report, the BHL stated for the first time that the tenement was not an adequate type of dwelling unit and implied that home ownership represented the key to building a modern residential environment. And this is a quotation. Any city's greatest asset is its homes. Tenement houses do not provide real homes, no matter how well constructed. They are not the best place for children to live in. We must see to it that the single-family home habit is continued. End quote. In addition to a new building code, the BHL residential strategy called for the development of a comprehensive zoning law that would divide the community into districts and protect residents' neighborhoods against invasion by undesirable structures. The League's report stated, it would be short-sighted policy to encourage the construction of small homes and to foster home ownership, and at the same time fail to take every precaution to see to it that the residential districts are not properly protected. The BHL acknowledged that some subdivisions were protected by restrictive covenants, and I hope they get more into those restrictive covenants, but indicated that such restrictions were unreliable and that only a comprehensive zoning system would protect neighborhoods from an invasion of bad housing, factories, and commercial buildings. And that was a quote. No, it wasn't. The second report was indicated that home ownership was beyond the economic reach of quote-unquote ordinary workers. These wage earners could not afford new houses, and therefore the best that could be done would be to construct houses for those with a higher income with a view to relieving the pressure from the top. Trickle down, okay? Thus, in stating its new approach to residential development, the BHL suggested that no new housing should be built in the basin. Rather, new dwelling units should be constructed in the valley and hilltop neighborhoods. And as people moved out of the basin there, old housing could, there it is. I hadn't even seen that. And here's in quotations, trickle down. Don't you just love that terminology? Trickle down to lower income groups. Footnote. Simultaneously, the BHL supported Cincinnati's nascent city planning movement. Without a city plan, there can be no successful solution to the housing problem, asserted the League. The battle for a comprehensive city plan was led by Alfred Bettman, a Harvard-trained lawyer and one of the country's leading advocates of city planning, and the United City Planning Committee, UCPC, a citizens group formed in 1915. The UCPC raised over $100,000 for the preparation of a city plan. And in May 1921, the Technical Advisory Corporation, an urban planning consultant firm, was hired to conduct a preliminary city planning survey. As a result of these activities, Cincinnati enacted in 1924 a comprehensive zoning law. The zoning law created 3 different types of residential areas. Residential Class A reserved land exclusively for single-family homes, while Class B permitted both 2- and 4-family detached housing. Class C allowed for the building of any type of family dwelling unit. The zoning law codified the city's emerging class-stratified residential environment and legally reinforced the economic walls separating the various residential districts. And in 1925, Cincinnati became the first American city to adopt an official city plan. Yes, and I have that. I will download it or provide you the link to it. During the 1920s, the BHL also called for the development of subdivision regulations to control residential land use in Hamilton County. While building codes and zoning laws could protect neighborhoods in the city, the absence of land use controls in the county meant that the slums could spread to the suburbs by allowing speculators to create cheaply developed subdivisions. During the 1920s and 1930s, land speculators sometimes developed subdivisions without paved roads, sewage, water, and electricity. Subdivision regulations would keep this from happening. The residential development strategy articulated by the BHL, the city planning advocates, and the other housing reformers guided Cincinnati's residential development process throughout the remainder of the industrial city era. Formation of the Black Ghetto-Slum. As one-family homes were being erected and whites were being dispersed throughout Cincinnati's valley and hilltop neighborhoods, a black ghetto slum was forming in the basin. Economic factors and the policies promoted by the BHL and the housing reformers played a big role in this. The emergence of a residential environment segregated on the basis of home ownership and housing cost coincided with the migration of thousands of Southern blacks into Cincinnati. Between 1900 and 1940, the city's black population grew from 15,000 to 56,000. The blacks as a proportion of the total population jumped from 4 to 12%. The black population experienced its greatest rate of growth during the 1920s, when about 18,000 blacks moved to the city. Housing costs determined where most African Americans initially settled in Cincinnati. Most blacks labored in positions at the bottom of Cincinnati's occupational ladder. 86% worked as unskilled laborers and domestics and personal servants, as compared to 20% of native whites and whites with foreign or mixed percentages, and 29% of immigrants. Table 6.6. Only a handful of blacks held positions at the top of the ladder. Blacks comprised, for instance, only 2% of professionals and 2% of proprietors, managers, and officials. And most black professionals, 77%, were ministers, musicians, and teachers of music. Not doctors, dentists, lawyers, judges, mechanical engineers, editors, and reporters. There were no black bankers, brokers, moneylenders, wholesale dealers, importers, exporters, city officials, or inspectors. The black middle class was very small, and its income base extremely fragile. Occupational differences led to significant differences in the type of housing that black and white workers could afford. African Americans, for the most part, could not afford to purchase homes in the formal housing market. They did not make enough money. In 1930, for instance, blacks owned only 1,126, or 2.49%, of the city's 45,085 owner-occupied dwelling units. Significantly, the handful of blacks who owned their homes owned the cheapest housing in Cincinnati. The median value of black owner-occupied housing was only $4,496, as compared to $7,464 and $8,003 for foreign-born and native whites, respectively. Even more important, 26% of black owner-occupied housing cost under $3,000, as compared to 5% of both native and foreign-born whites. And 93% of the housing owned by blacks was valued at under $10,000 a year, while only 54% of the housing owned by whites fell below this figure. Most blacks living in Cincinnati were renters, and the data show that they occupied the cheapest rental housing in Cincinnati. In 1930, the median monthly rental for black-occupied dwelling units was $20, as compared to $27 and $28 for foreign-born and native whites. Moreover, 79% of the dwelling units occupied by blacks rented for less than $30 a month, as compared to 56% for the foreign-born and 54% for native whites. The data are clear. Income and economics of the housing market were central factors in determining the type of housing available to African Americans and where in the city that housing was located. Low wages forced blacks to search for housing in the city's low-rent district, which was located in the west end of the basin, an area bounded by Court Street, and the Ohio River, and falling between Central Avenue and Freeman. This is where the Ghetto-Slum formed, map 6.5. By 1930, more than 30,000 blacks, comprising 67% of the African American population, lived there. No physical wall encircling the ghetto, but a wall of high rent did isolate blacks from their more affluent white neighbors. Building codes, zoning laws, the 1925 city plan, and subdivision regulations reinforced this wall. In the 1920s and 1930s, an informal housing market existed that catered to the needs of low-wage workers. This market emerged in the late 1800s and was fully developed by the 1920s. It consisted of real estate speculators, building material companies, banks, savings and loan companies, builders, and an army of carpenters, all willing to help low-income workers build their own houses. This existence of this informal market meant that ambitious, determined low-income blacks could acquire or build cheap housing in the valley and hilltop regions or in the suburbs. For instance, by 1930, blacks had developed residential areas in the suburbs of College Hill, the Steele subdivision, Kennedy Heights, Wyoming, Laughlin, Woodland, and Hazelwood. In Cincinnati, there were 6 census tracts outside with the basin in which 400 or more blacks resided. Let me read that again. In Cincinnati, there were 6 census tracts outside with the basin in which that must be a typo, in which the 400 or more blacks resided. Track 15, 21, 36, 37, 55, and 77. And I think 36 and 37 are Evanston. And there were 13 census tracts outside the basin in which 100 to 399 blacks resided. Okay. That's track 24, 49, 54, 56, 58, 60, 62, 65, 69, 79, 80, 82, and 105. Approximately 13,542 African Americans lived in these 19 census tracts. Many of these blacks resided in inexpensive dwelling units. In some of these neighborhoods, especially those located in the suburbs, the houses were crudely constructed shacks located on poorly developed lots with unpaved roads. The residents of these communities of homeowners were proud of their neighborhoods. Housing reformers, however, had a different attitude. They believed that low-income black housing settlements represented a major threat to the homeownership and to the development of moderate to high-rent neighborhoods. Standish Meacham of the BHL referred to them as quote-unquote bad spots, which were potential slums. He called, for example, the Black Laughlin suburb, which was Lincoln Heights, quote, the ugliest collection of shacks I have ever seen, unquote. The director of buildings for the city, Clifford M. Stegner, called these low-income residential settlements a, quote-unquote, menace to the city. Marquette Stegner, Alfred Bettman, and other housing reformers were particularly concerned that low-income black settlements such as the communities in College Hill, Laughlin, and Hazelwood, would lead to slums forming in the suburbs. In the 1920s and 1930s, there were virtually no residential land use regulations in Hamilton County. In this setting, any type of subdivision could be developed, and people could build any type of house. In the BHL's 1928 report, Marquette worried, quote, we find developing just outside the corporation lines potential slums, which will eventually contain all of the bad conditions we are fighting against now, unquote. The BHL called for establishment of a regional planning commission and for the development of subdivision regulations to promote, quote-unquote, orderly growth in the county. A central goal of the housing reformers was to confine low-income black workers into the basin by using building codes, zoning laws, subdivision regulations, and comprehensive city planning to outlaw cheap housing in other parts of Cincinnati and Hampton County. Simultaneously, they planned to encourage higher income whites to move out of the basin so that their old houses could trickle down to blacks. This strategy was advanced in 1924 when black leaders and members of the Cincinnati Community Chest asked the BHL to develop a plan for addressing the worsening black housing problem. The BHL told blacks and their supporters that, quote, "It is impossible to build houses directly for the colored people because the facts show that their wages are insufficient to pay the cost of present-day construction," unquote. The BHL then suggested that friends of African Americans should be encouraged to invest their money in the building of new houses for whites. This, the BHL indicated, while not relieving colored families directly, would tend to relieve them indirectly by drawing white families out of the district now occupied for the most part by colored people. End quote. Footnote. Confinement in the basin and trickle-down housing were to become the cornerstones of the housing reformers' strategy for dealing with the black housing problem. The BHL even tried to keep blacks from escaping to white-dominated neighborhoods on the fringe of the basin. When realtors started to rent and sell to blacks dwelling units in the white working-class neighborhood of Mohawk-Brighton, the BHL tried to stop the practice because of the, quote, "outbursts of violent feeling and bitterness," end quote. The BHL asked its visiting social workers and housekeepers to persuade blacks not to move into the neighborhood and intensified its efforts to find, quote, "room for the expansion of colored people without this scattering into white neighborhoods," end quote. The real estate industry and white homeowners also tried to keep blacks concentrated in the basin. For example, in the 1920s, the Cincinnati Real Estate Board mandated, quote, "No agent shall rent or sell property to colored people in an established white section or neighborhood, and this inhabitation should be particularly applicable to the hilltops and suburban properties," end quote. Footnote. Jacob G. Schmidlap said that when he tried to build low-income housing for blacks in Avondale, quote, "Whites in the neighborhood objected to us renting to colored tenants, although we had bought the plot from a colored man and his people were living on each side of the lot," end quote. Footnote. Also, the housing reform movement conducted a massive public relations campaign to win support for its housing program. The goal of the campaign was to, quote, "arouse the public to the serious housing plight of the poor," end quote, by creating, quote, "a graphic picture of the conditions under which our underprivileged families are compelled to live," end quote. This campaign consisted of public speeches, newspaper articles, and a moving picture. The blighting effect of bad housing and the need to contain it in the basin were the central themes of this campaign. Since most blacks lived in bad housing, and since their housing situation was considered the worst in the city, the public relations campaign may have exacerbated racial animosity. These urban policies trapped most blacks in the basin and transformed the ghetto into a slum. They forced blacks to live in a volatile land use conversion zone where housing units were being demolished to make way for economic development. In 1925, the 1925 city plan zoned most of the basin for commercial and industrial development. This meant that blacks had to build their community in a poor residential environment, an unstable setting characterized by omnipresent construction and demolition. For instance, in 16 select years between 1908 and 1938, 29.3% of the 1,990 new factories, offices, service shops, and amusement places constructed in Cincinnati were built in the basin. In the same period, 47.5%, or N equals 1,638, of the 3,449 buildings demolished in Cincinnati were located in the basin. The most intense period of residential displacement occurred between 1924 and 1934, when 1,169 residential buildings housing more than 3,514 families were demolished. Between 1920 and 1935, the Black Basin population jumped from 19,776 to 39,042. Black population growth and the ongoing consumption of residential land by factories, stores, shops, office buildings, rail spurs, and passenger and freight terminals led to the deterioration of housing and neighborhood conditions in the basin. For example, between 1934 and 1935, the number of basin dwelling units classified as good by the Department of Buildings decreased from 7,561 to 5,836, while the number of dwellings classified as very bad, and fair increased from 5,812 to 7,462. Congestion, poor living conditions, inadequate health care delivery, low wages, and the concentration of social and health problems in the basin made the Black Ghetto Slum a very undesirable place to live. Yet, the policies promoted by the BHL and the housing reform movement made escape to Cincinnati's white-dominated valley and hilltop neighborhoods difficult. Conclusion. Cincinnati's biracial residential environment persisted until 1920. But during the decades of the 1920s and 1930s, residential segregation increased dramatically. It was in this period that the Ghetto-Slum took form. The growing segregation of blacks coincided with the emergence of a housing reform movement based on the promotion of home ownership and the protection of residential districts from an invasion of bad housing and factories and commercial building. Housing reformers believed that home ownership and homogeneous class-stratified neighborhoods were central to the building of a modern residential environment. To protect neighborhoods from non-conforming patterns of land use and to encourage home ownership, they used building codes, zoning laws, and subdivision regulations. These public policies, combined with the practices of the real estate industry and white homeowners, kept most blacks out of the new white neighborhoods developing in Cincinnati's hilltop and valley districts, and segregated them in the basin area. Blacks and whites began to live in two very different types of neighborhoods. Most whites now lived in neighborhoods dominated by single-family, owner-occupied dwelling units, characterized by open space and amenities. Blacks, on the other hand, lived in the tenement-dominated low-rent district, where they shared residential space with factories, buildings, and railroads. In Cincinnati public policy and the building of the modern residential environment contributed to the formation of a black ghetto slum. Let me read that again. In Cincinnati, public policies and the building of a modern residential environment contributed to the formation of a black ghetto slum. The city building process played a prominent role in ghetto slum formation. So that's the end of Essay 6, Chapter 6, written by Henry Louis Taylor Jr., and this gentleman has also written other books. So I'd be interested to read them as well. I will scan and post these charts and maps and superimpose them on the screen for your observation. So thank you so very much for joining me, and do share this. Share this information, my reading. You don't have to read it. I'll read it to you. You can do it while you're working in the kitchen, working in the garden, driving somewhere in your car. You can listen as I read to you. But this information is extremely important for all Cincinnatians to know. All Cincinnatians need to know how our communities came to be and why gentrification is such a stab in the gut after all we've been through already. So join me next time. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.